The night Emma Calloway moved in next door, Daniel Reyes realized that geography sometimes carried a sense of humor sharper than any friend he'd ever known. He was 41, worked as a furniture restoration specialist out of a converted garage behind his house, and had spent the last 2 years living the kind of quiet, steady life that felt less like recovery and more like waiting. He'd been divorced 18 months earlier from a woman who loved the stability of a man with his own business until stability started to look too much like ordinary evenings and not enough like magazine spreads. Daniel had just finished sanding a cherry dining table when he heard the moving truck pull up. He walked to the kitchen window with a glass of water and saw her stepping out of a sedan, hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing paint-stained jeans and an oversized sweater. She turned toward his property, met his eyes through the glass, and smiled. Not a polite neighbor smile. A smile that recognized him. Emma Calloway. The woman he'd turned down for a date 17 years ago in college because he'd been too focused on graduating early and too convinced that relationships were distractions he couldn't afford. She'd asked him to a campus art show. He'd said no. She'd nodded once and never asked again. Daniel set the glass down and walked outside before he could talk himself out of it. She was pulling a box from the back seat when he reached the low fence separating their driveways. "Emma," he said. She looked up, set the box on the hood of the car, and stepped closer. "Daniel Reyes," she said. "Funny how life works, isn't it?" He offered to help with the heavier boxes. She accepted. They carried furniture and lamps and kitchen supplies into a small 2-bedroom rental that smelled like fresh paint and old carpet. The moving crew had already brought in the couch and bed frame, but Emma had declined their help with the smaller items, claiming she liked to unpack at her own pace. Daniel believed her. She moved with the same deliberate care he remembered from college studio classes where she'd worked on ceramic pieces while he'd worked on architectural models at the next table over. They worked in silence for the first 3 trips. On the 4th, she handed him a framed print wrapped in brown paper. "Careful with that one," she said. "It's the only thing my ex didn't try to claim in the split." Daniel carried it inside and set it against the living room wall. When he came back out, she was leaning against the fence with a bottle of water. "You're still here," she said. "Thought maybe you'd remember an urgent project and disappear." He shook his head. "I don't run from things anymore." She raised an eyebrow. "Anymore?" He looked at her directly. "I was 21 and stupid, if that's what you're asking." She took a slow drink from the bottle. "I wasn't asking," but noted. She handed him a second bottle from the cooler in her trunk. They stood there as the afternoon light turned amber across the street and the sound of a distant lawnmower hummed through the trees. Emma told him she'd been living 2 towns over until a month ago when her engagement fell apart. The man's name was Colin. He worked in finance, looked good in photos, and had slowly convinced her that every decision she made needed his approval first. She'd finally left when he'd told her that moving closer to her aging mother was selfish because it would inconvenience his commute. "So I moved anyway," she said. "And here we are." Daniel asked if she needed anything else carried. She looked at the remaining boxes, then back at him. "Actually, yes. There's a bookshelf in the truck. It's flat-packed and probably weighing about 60 pounds. If you help me get it inside, I'll owe you dinner." He tilted his head. "You don't owe me anything." She smiled again, slower this time. "I know, but I'd still like to buy you dinner." They went to a diner 3 blocks away that served breakfast all day and had wooden booths that creaked when you slid into them. Emma ordered coffee and waffles. Daniel ordered the same. The waitress brought 2 mismatched mugs and a carafe that looked older than both of them. Emma wrapped her hands around the mug and looked across the table. "So, furniture restoration. That's what you do now?" Daniel nodded. "Spent 10 years in commercial architecture. Hated it. Started fixing up old chairs on weekends. One thing led to another." She leaned forward. "Do you like it?" He paused, considering the question more carefully than most people did. "I like working with my hands. I like seeing something broken turn into something people want to keep." "Yeah, I like it." She nodded slowly, as if his answer had confirmed something she'd already guessed. "That makes sense," she said. "You were always better at fixing things than building them from scratch." He looked at her. "What do you do?" She smiled. "I teach art therapy at a community center. Mostly kids, some adults. People who need to make things but don't know how to start." Their food arrived. They ate without talking for a few minutes, the silence comfortable in a way that surprised him. Then Emma set her fork down and looked at him with the same directness she'd had 17 years earlier. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly. "After tonight, I feel like I should be nervous." She grinned. "You probably should." She paused, took a sip of coffee. "Are you always this careful?" He met her eyes. "Depends on what I'm trying not to break." She didn't answer right away. When she looked back, her expression had shifted into something warmer and more deliberate. "Well, for the record, I'm not made of glass." They finished dinner. Daniel paid before she could argue. She let him, but only after making it clear she'd cover the next one. He walked her back to her house. The porch light was on, casting long shadows across the driveway. She stopped at the door and turned. "Thanks for today," she said. "For the boxes. For dinner. For not pretending you didn't remember me." He shook his head. I remembered. A week passed. Daniel saw her most mornings when she left for work, carrying a canvas bag and a travel mug, hair still damp from the shower. He waved. She waved back. On Thursday evening, she knocked on his door holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. "I made too much," she said. "Thought you might want some." He invited her in. They ate at his kitchen table while rain tapped against the windows. She asked about the table they were sitting at. He told her he'd restored it from a curb find 3 years ago. She ran her hand along the edge. "You're good at this," she said. The following Saturday, Emma's ex-fiancé showed up. Daniel was outside staining a chair frame when a silver sedan pulled into her driveway. A man stepped out wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt that looked like it had been ironed that morning. Colin. Daniel recognized the type immediately. Polished, controlled. The kind of man who used calm as a weapon. Colin knocked. Emma opened the door but didn't invite him in. Daniel couldn't hear the first part of the conversation, but he heard Colin's voice rise. "You're being unreasonable, Emma. We can fix this if you'd just listen." Emma's voice stayed level. "I listened for 2 years, Colin. I'm done." Colin stepped closer. "You don't mean that." Daniel set the brush down and walked toward the fence. "She sounded pretty clear to me," he said. Colin turned, eyes narrowing. "And you are?" Emma stepped onto the porch. "This is Daniel, my neighbor, and you're leaving." Colin's jaw tightened. "This is why we can't have a rational conversation? You always bring other people into it." Daniel crossed his arms. "Funny, she looks public enough to leave." Colin stared at him for a long moment, then turned back to Emma. "This isn't over." Emma shook her head. "Yes, it is." She went inside and closed the door. Colin stood there for another 10 seconds, then got back in his car and drove away. Daniel walked over. Emma opened the door before he could knock. Her face was composed, but her hands were shaking slightly. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah. I just hate that he still thinks he has a say." Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "He doesn't." She looked at him. "I know, but thank you for saying it anyway." She stepped back. "Do you want to come in? I have coffee. Or something stronger if you prefer." They sat on her couch with whiskey and mismatched glasses. She told him more about Colin, about the small corrections that built up over time, about the way he'd made her feel like her instincts were always wrong, about the relief she'd felt the day she'd finally packed her things and left. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, she leaned back and closed her eyes. "Sorry," she said. "That was a lot." He shook his head. "You don't have to apologize." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Why didn't you say yes? Back in college, when I asked you to that art show?" He set his glass down carefully. "Because I was 21 and convinced that anything that made me happy was a distraction I couldn't afford. I thought focus meant saying no to everything that wasn't on the plan." She studied his face. "And now?" He met her gaze. "Now I know that the plan doesn't matter if you end up alone at the finish line." She reached over and touched his hand briefly. "Good answer." 2 weeks later, Emma invited him to a gallery opening downtown. A former student of hers had a show. Daniel wore a button-down shirt that wasn't wrinkled and drove them in his truck. The gallery was small, warm, and filled with people holding wine in plastic cups. Emma introduced him to the artist, a young woman in her 20s who hugged Emma like she'd saved her life. They looked at the paintings together. Emma stood close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. Halfway through the evening, a woman approached. Mid-40s, blonde, expensive coat. She smiled at Emma. "Emma Calloway, I thought that was you." Emma's posture shifted slightly. "Marissa." The woman looked at Daniel, then back at Emma. "Is this the rebound?" Emma's expression didn't change. "This is Daniel, my neighbor and friend." Marissa raised her eyebrows. "Friend. Right. Well, just be careful. Colin's been telling everyone you left him for someone else." Daniel stepped forward slightly. "That's because Colin can't admit someone left him because he wasn't worth staying for." Marissa blinked. Emma took Daniel's arm. "We're done here, Marissa." They walked to the other side of the gallery. Emma exhaled slowly. "Sorry about that. Marissa and Colin's sister are friends. She's been fishing for drama since the breakup." Daniel looked down at her. "You don't need to apologize for other people's garbage." They left early. Daniel drove her home. When they pulled into the driveway, Emma turned toward him. "Can I ask you something?" He smiled slightly. "You keep asking if you can ask." She laughed. "Fair. Okay, here's the actual question. Are you trying not to kiss me, or am I reading this wrong?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm trying not to rush something I don't want to mess up." She leaned closer. "What if I told you that careful is just fear with better manners?" He reached up and touched her cheek. "Then I'd say you're probably right." He kissed her, soft, deliberate, unhurried. When he pulled back, she was smiling. "Took you long enough," she said. 3 months later, Colin made one last attempt. He showed up at Emma's door on a Sunday morning with flowers and an apology that sounded rehearsed. Emma told him no. He tried again. She said no louder. Daniel stepped onto his porch. Colin saw him and his expression hardened. "This is between me and Emma," Colin said. Emma crossed her arms. "No, this is me telling you to leave." Again, Colin's composure finally cracked. "You think this is going to last? You think he's any different?" Emma stepped closer. "I know he's different because he listens when I say no." Colin left. He didn't come back. A year and a half after Emma moved in, Daniel proposed in her kitchen on a Tuesday night over takeout and badly reheated coffee. She said yes before he finished the question. They got married 6 months later in Daniel's backyard under string lights with 20 people who mattered and no one who didn't. Emma wore a simple dress. Daniel wore the same button-down shirt from the gallery. They danced to a song playing from a phone speaker. It was the best night of his life. Now they share the house Daniel bought 7 years ago. Emma teaches in the mornings. Daniel restores furniture in the afternoons. They drink coffee on the porch most evenings and talk about days that were ordinary in the best possible way. Sometimes Emma looks at him and says, "Funny how life works, isn't it?" And every time Daniel agrees. "What would you have done if someone you'd turned down years ago moved in next door? And have you ever gotten a second chance at something you thought you'd lost for good?" Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.